Some people call them Christmas tree cactus because of the red berries on there. But they are a member of the cholla. And that's one member that you don't want to mess with. They will get you. Prickly pear. Flat leaf cactus pear. Those little red pears on them. When they're ripe, they make a real good jelly, jam. And most of them are ripe right now. They're kind of a deep red, almost a purple color. They're very sweet. They even tell me they're making margaritas out of those now. Prickly pear margarita. Don't know how they taste because I don't drink it. I've heard they're pretty good. Let's stop and see if this old Indian's home. Come on in. Welcome to America's first mobile home. This is what the Indians lived in, at least the Indians who hunted the buffalo. This teepee is a 16-foot teepee. It means it's 16 feet across the base of it. It would have been home for a family of 3, 4, maybe even 5. Of course, the Indians didn't really live in these in the summer, but they did in the winter. The thing about the teepee is it's very easy to cool in the summer and it's very easy to heat in the winter. And because of the shape of the teepee, the wind does not blow against it. It blows around it. Now, a lot of people don't believe that, so I always tell them next time you get the opportunity, go buy a snow cone. Take that little snow cone cup outside, turn it upside down and set it down. See what happens when the wind blows. It may spin, but it doesn't blow away near as fast as any other cup that you take out there and put down. So the wind does blow around the teepee. In fact, a teepee just exactly like this size, I was living out in Tennessee and Kentucky and Indiana, and I went to an intertribal festival at Evansville, Indiana. They asked me to set my teepee up on a little hill so that everybody driving by could see it, hoping that more people would come to the tribal festival there. So I set it up, and down in the little valley below me there were some scouts, Boy Scouts, who came out and set up the 60 Boy Scout tents. So there were about 120 scouts, 2 to a tent. Well, the first night there, a big thunderstorm blew in. And wind blew, thunder, lightning, a lot of rain. I got up next morning, I walked outside the teepee, and there was not one Boy Scout tent standing. Every one of them had blown down, and there were 120 soaking wet Boy Scouts, freezing to death. Teepee was fine. They told me that the winds got up to 75 miles an hour that night. I didn't know it. I slept like a baby in the teepee. So the wind does not blow against it near as much as any other temporary structure. But the teepee is easy to cool in the summer. You can roll the bottom up and let the breeze blow through it. It stays pretty comfortable in here. In the winter, there is another canvas, or back in the old days it would have been buffalo hide, that tied to the inside of these poles and went all the way to the ground. That made a double wall from about here down. The outer hide or canvas is up off the ground, so the wind could come underneath, come up between those two walls and take the smoke out the top. A lot of people don't know this, but the teepees were not owned by the men. It was the women who owned the teepees. And that was okay, because that meant the women had to take them down, move them, and put them up. Of course, the women said the men never could do it right anyway, so they didn't mind. One of the things, though, that I like to show people in the teepee here is this little piece of steel. The Indians on the East Coast had metal as soon as the English landed out there. The Indians southwest of here had metal because of the Spaniards coming in through old Mexico. The Indians in the northwest had metal because Canada was occupied by France back back then. Many of the Indians, though, in the Great Plains here, had never seen metal, or for that matter a white man, until the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1802, 1803. Lewis and Clark knew that if you give an Indian a gift, that Indian feels he owes you a gift in return. So for that reason, Lewis and Clark had almost 500 of these little pieces of steel made to give to the Indians that they were going to meet along the way. Now what Lewis and Clark wanted in return was just safe passage through Indian territory. What Lewis and Clark didn't know was they were not going to be able to communicate with all the Indians they met, because many of the Indians spoke different languages. So it was more or less luck that they had hired a French guide who was married to an Indian woman, Sacagawea, and he refused to go with them unless he could take Sacagawea and the baby along. So it was actually Sacagawea who ended up communicating with these Indians through sign language, and because she could communicate, she was the one who gave them this little gift of tempered steel. Well, the Indians had never seen steel, or a white man, so they wanted to know what this alien was, you know, and what is this? So she would calmly try to explain in sign language. But to explain this little piece of steel, she would ask if she could borrow a piece of flint. Well, all Indians carried flints, what they made their arrowheads, knife blades, scrapers out of. So the Indian would hand her a piece of flint, and she would take this piece of steel and she'd say, watch close. Hit them together, you get sparks. Well, this was pretty interesting. The Indians had seen sparks jump out of a fire, but they'd never seen sparks jump out of that piece of flint that they had been carrying with them. So this was pretty interesting. Well, she would explain to them that you can make a fire with this. You just have to have a couple of things. One thing that you need is either rotten punky wood, or char cloth. Now, char cloth is cotton material, 100% cotton material that's been burned without air. It will catch a spark, but it won't actually make the fire. To make the fire, you have to have a tinder, which is anything that burns easy, dry grass, weed, cedar bark. That will start the fire, but this char cloth or punky wood will only catch the spark. So she'd show them that you can put that punky wood or the char cloth on top of that piece of flint, and you can hit that piece of flint, and when you get a spark on that char cloth, it will glow. You'll know because it'll start to get hot. So then to make that fire, all you have to do is wrap this tinder around that char cloth and blow on it. Add little sticks and twigs, and in a few minutes you've got a campfire. This became very important to the American Indians. They wanted a striker like this before they wanted metal tomahawks, knives, guns, gunpowder, any of that other stuff, because this literally changed the lives of the American Indians. Before the striker, this piece of steel, they had two ways to get fire. One was with a fire bow, which is what most people call rubbing sticks together, but you can't make a fire rubbing sticks together. A fire bow you can, but it takes anywhere from 2 to 5 minutes usually to make a fire with a fire bow. You can make a fire with this piece of steel and flint in less than 30 seconds if you're good at it. In fact, I do rendezvous, mountain man rendezvous, and we always have a fire starting contest. The last contest I was in, I made the fire in 8 seconds.
Wow.
And I came in second.
Wow.
Somebody did it in 6, beat me.
Wow.
So it doesn't take long if you're used to it, if you know how to do it. So that flint and steel was pretty important to the American Indians.
That's neat.
I like to show people how it was done because most people have heard of fire with flint and steel, but not a lot of people have ever seen it. So now you can say, if nothing else, you've seen it done. It can be done. So there's a little bit of information on the teepee and fire with flint and steel. The teepee is a good way to live. And I don't say that because I believe it to be true. I say it because I've lived in a teepee. I've spent 5 years of my life living in a teepee. 2 of those years were in the bottom of this canyon in a teepee.
Wow.
So it's not a bad way to live.
Cool.
You know, there are good things and bad things about it. In the summer, occasionally you have a visitor come call, such as a rattlesnake might crawl in, but you know, if you leave him alone, sooner or later he'll leave. In the winter time, I actually prefer winter because it's easier to heat than it is to cool. And in the winter, nobody's around, you know, so you pretty much got the place to yourself. Just a small fire. In fact, this teepee is easier to heat than a 16 square foot room because a room has square corners in it and a teepee doesn't. So it's just a small fire will keep you pretty toasty in here.
That's interesting.
So it's really not a bad way to live. The worst part about the teepee in this part of the country is you have to travel to either New Mexico or Colorado to get the poles. But these are pine, and they're called lodgepole pine. There's nothing unusual about them except they grow so close together under large trees that they have to grow tall and straight to get any sunlight. So these particular poles came from Taos, New Mexico. So about every 5 or 6 years I go over and buy a couple of sets of poles. A lot of people ask, how'd they get up there and get that rope around it? Well, they didn't. You start with all the poles laying on the ground, and you take 3 of them, tie them together and set them up as a tripod. You got this big old long rope tied around those 3 poles. Then you set 4 poles up. There's an order to put them up in. You set 4 poles over here, come over here, set up 4, and then you come to the back and set up 3. Now there are 15 poles in here. Your last pole is this one. It's called the canvas or lift pole, and this is the one that the canvas is tied to. Now after you've got 14 of the poles up, all of them but this canvas, you take this rope and you walk clockwise 4 times around the outside. Pull it together tight. That keeps 14 of these poles tight, and you stake them to the ground. I need to tighten this rope, but that stakes 14 poles down. Your 15th pole is the one that the canvas is tied to, so when you put it up, the canvas goes up. You pull the canvas around and lace it together. Then you stake the canvas down to the ground. So 14 of these 15 poles are staked to the ground, and then on top of that, the canvas is staked to the ground. And that's another reason why wind doesn't affect it much. Just blows around it. 17 poles is normally what it takes. You have 2 poles for your smoke flaps outside. You can close those flaps to keep the rain or the snow out, or you can adjust them to where the wind blowing past will actually pull the smoke out. It takes a little experimenting though to mess with those smoke flaps. Yeah, you'd be surprised how little rain you get in here, even in a big heavy rain. Most of it runs down the pole. So if you have your liner in here, which usually is tied to a piece of rope like this, you take 2 sticks and you put them in here like this. So the water runs down the center of the poles, never touches that rope. It just runs all the way to the ground. So all your canvas stays dry, except for the outer canvas, and the sun will dry that. So it's not a bad way to live, it's really not. Indian,
Recliner.
yeah,
Easy
recliner.
boy.
Yep, made of willow, roll it up, carry it wherever you want. So there's a little information about the teepee. I used to have this set up a little better, but getting close to the end of the season, so I've been kind of cleaning it out. We'll probably leave it up year round, but unless I have to go to a rendezvous, I'll take it down and take it with me. Back in about 1897, I believe it was, Charlie Goodnight sold this ranch to his wife's brothers, the Dyer brothers, and this became known as the T. Anchor Ranch. Headquarters of the ranch were in Canyon, Texas, or what is Canyon, Texas now, about 12 miles from here. And it was one of the first ranches where the headquarters was not actually located on the ranch itself. But that's the way the Dyers wanted it, and it was their place, so that's the way they did it. In 1923, they sold this ranch to Charlie Elkins, and it's been in the Elkins family ever since. Back in the 1930s and 40s, the extended Elkins family would get together out here on the ranch occasionally on the weekends. And when they did, all the kids, all the cousins would get together and they'd hike down here into the canyon and play. Well, one weekend, one of the adults followed them down here to see where they were and what they were doing. When they found out where the kids were playing, they promptly put a stop to it, wouldn't let them come down here by themselves anymore. But this area became one of the favorite picnic areas for the family. They occasionally would bring some food down here and some blankets, and they'd spend the day having a picnic, visiting. Well, this little area where the kids were playing and where the adults would come picnic, that's our next stop. And it's just right up here around the bend a little bit. It's a place that we call the Waterfall. At one time it was a continuous waterfall, but as they tell me, about 1720 it began to change, or it was pretty much dried up by 1720. But we'll take a little walk down here to the waterfall. Great place to take photographs. And this is an area that you don't, well, this is something you wouldn't get to see from the state park. No place in the state park like this. This is where the kids were coming to play.
Oh my goodness, no wonder the parents were worried.
Now, the best way to get an idea of how far up we are is to get down here and crawl up to the edge and look over.
We'll trust you.
Well, you know, if you're kneeling down here or laying down, you can't fall. But it's a lot further than you'd think. There's nothing down there to compare to. So you look down there, you think, well, it's not that far. But listen to how long it takes this rock to hit.
I don't love them.
It's a long way down.
It's a long way down.
Of course, the fall won't hurt you. It's that sudden stop at the end that'll get you. Water running through here was about this deep for about a half hour, 45 minutes. It was just amazing. Of course, the bad thing was I was down here to see it, which meant I was stuck. I was stranded. So I was stuck down here for maybe 3 hours, and then I could get back out. Now, if you come over on this other side, you can see how the water's carved out underneath this rock.
Be real quiet.
Don't remind her.
Yeah. Don't tell her she's that close. I do quite well when I get a chance. When I can sneak away out here by myself, I sit here, dangle my feet off the side, and just sit here.
You're not afraid of heights.
Well, I'm used to it. I'll put it that way. No, it's not the heights I'm afraid of. It's the fall that bothers me. You know.
It's not the fall, it's the sudden stop.
Yeah, it's that
That's
stop.
good.
Well, some people don't grasp the concept.
I don't know, but if I could get the number off that helicopter, I could have him arrested. A lot of the ranchers have cattle down in here, and a helicopter comes down here,
Scares
those cattle, they can hurt
You
themselves.
get his number?
In fact, Swanee
My
over there, she's still alive. She came out here earlier this summer, and she said, you know, I remember the day I carved that in there.
How old is she?
She's pushing 90, I guess. I was in, well, I guess you probably heard of Cynthia Ann Parker.
No.
No?
Why does that name sound familiar?
Well,
You're gonna find out.
back in 1836, at the age of 9 years old, a little strawberry blonde, blue-eyed white girl was abducted by the Comanche Indians. She grew up as a Comanche, married a chief by the name of Peter Nakona. They had 3 kids. Juana was the oldest. Got another son by the name of Pecos, but he was killed in a buffalo hunting accident when he was about 17. They had a daughter by the name of Prairie Flower. Juana grew up to become the last war chief of the Comanche Indians. Now, because Juana was half white, he was about a foot taller than most Comanche. Comanche, for the most part, were kind of short and stocky. Juana was tall and thin, and Juana is probably best known for the Battle of Adobe Walls. Adobe Walls is a buffalo hunters trading post that's about 90 miles north of us as the crow flies. And back in 1874, the government started sending buffalo hunters down in here to kill the buffalo, hoping that would solve the Indian problem. So, when the Indians found the buffalo hunters down in here, they followed the buffalo hunters back to Adobe Walls, where they found a whole bunch of buffalo hunters, and they decided to solve the buffalo hunter problem. They were just going to kill them all. So, Juana Parker, war chief of the Comanche, a Kiowa war chief by the name of Black Bear, and a Comanche medicine man by the name of Isate led 1,200 warriors against Adobe Walls on the last day of July, 1874. They killed 2 buffalo hunters in the initial attack, kept the remaining 24 buffalo hunters and 1 white woman pinned down inside the buildings for 4 days and 4 nights. On the 5th day, the Indians had taken so many casualties that they pulled back out of rifle range. They decided to starve the buffalo hunters out. Well, when the Indians pulled back, that allowed the buffalo hunters to leave the buildings they had been holed up in. So all the buffalo hunters were outside dragging off the carcasses of the horses and mules that had been killed in the battle. And there was a young man, a young buffalo hunter out there doing his share of the work. This old buffalo hunter walked up to him and he said, "Might you be this fella they call Dixon?" The young man said, "Yes, sir. Billy Dixon is the name." Old buffalo hunter said, "Well, I hear tell that you're about the best shot there is with a rifle in these parts." Billy Dixon said, "I'm fair with a rifle." Old buffalo hunter said, "Well, Mr. Billy, I'm fair with a rifle, Dixon." He said, "Look out yonder in the distance. You see them 3 Indians sitting on their horses out yonder on the hill?" Billy Dixon said, "Yes, sir, I see them." Old buffalo hunter said, "Well, Mr. Billy, I'm fair with a rifle, Dixon. If you can hit one of them Indians from here, I'll buy you a jug of whiskey." Billy Dixon said, "Well, those Indians are out of rifle range." Old buffalo hunter said, "So what you got to lose? It ain't gonna cost you nothing but some powder and lead. And if you do hit one, Mr. Billy, I'm fair with a rifle, Dixon, I'll buy you a jug of whiskey." Well, Billy looked out at the Indians. He turned back to the old buffalo hunter. He said, "Well, sir, what size jug?" Old buffalo hunter said, "The biggest jug you can find, Mr. Billy, I'm fair with a rifle, Dixon." So Billy Dixon said, "Well, never let it be said I wouldn't try." He picked up his Sharps 50 caliber rifle. He loaded it, knelt down, took careful aim, adjusted a little bit for windage and elevation. Squeezed the trigger. There was a big boom and a puff of black smoke from the end of the barrel. Billy stood up and he leaned the rifle against the wall of the building. He and the old buffalo hunter looked at those 3 Indians on their horses out on the hill. The old buffalo hunter said, "Well, looks to me like you missed." About that time, the Indian on the center horse was knocked backwards off his horse. Billy Dixon wrote in his journal that was the luckiest shot he ever made in his life. Also said it was the sweetest tasting whiskey he ever put to his lips. The Indians said the white man's medicine is too strong. They shoot at you yesterday and the bullet finds you tomorrow. So they left. That one shot ended the siege at the Battle of Adobe Walls. They measured the distance of that shot. It was 7/8 of a mile. Longest shot ever recorded with a black powder rifle. Now, the Indian who was knocked off his horse was the Comanche medicine man by the name of Isate. And that's kind of ironic because Isate had convinced all those 1,200 warriors that his medicine was so strong if they followed him into battle, the white man's bullets would not be able to find him. So when this white man's bullet knocked Isate off his horse, nobody ever paid much attention to Isate after that. And incidentally, Isate, translated into English, is cow droppings. Only the droppings start with an S.
Okay.
And with a T.
Yep.
And that's true story. In fact, Billy Dixon's widow was one of the founders of the Panhandle Plains Museum in Canyon.
Huh.
So the rifle and most everything else Billy Dixon owned is in that museum.
Have you guys been to that?
Oh, you need to go there.
Yeah.